Hello, and welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to get to know yourself. I'm Abby Covert, and with me is my co-host, Alfi Alo. In this episode, Alfi and I talk about our peership origin story and look back on where we both were at the start of 2023 when we started working together at the Sensemakers Club. We talk through the core concepts of our course, Making Sense of Yourself, and reflect on what we've learned having just finished teaching this course for the first time. We also dig into how Alfie and I are similar and the ways in which we are quite different. We end our first pod with personal updates on how made sense of we each feel and a quick bit of advice for other seekers making sense of themselves. Thanks for being here, Sensemaker. Without further ado, let's get on to the pod, our very first pod. Hello, Sensemakers, and welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to figure out who you are and what you want in this world. I'm Abby Covert, and with me is my co-host, Alfie Alou.
It's been about 12 months now working on this project, and it is finally coming to a close. We have our first cohort about to finish. And there's a lot to talk about. But if you're interested, if you want to hear more, definitely check out the waiting list on the sensemakersclub.com.
So, Alfie, to start this whole thing, do you want to tell them the story of how we met, or should I?
I think I'll give it a stab. I think I will give it a stab because in some ways it feels like it was so long ago, but in other ways it feels like it was just the other day. But I think, it really started off when I was beginning my own journey in speaking and kind of getting to engage with all of that. And I saw a LinkedIn post about this group that I hadn't heard about since until that point. And so I kind of I read through all of that, and I submitted my application to talk a little bit about something I hope we'll get into a little bit more detail about, but speaking about mentorship, specifically in the context of diagrams. And I submitted that. And, I think when I submitted, I didn't necessarily know where all of this was going to lead me, because at that point I was really hyper-focused on speaking and kind of how I could make a little bit of progress on that side. And it eventually led me to, speak at the Sensemakers Club for the very first time. But in preparation for the talk, you and I actually started to spend some time talking about some of the ideas I was going to be sharing and engaging in some of that. And I think it started to become clear to me that there was something like valuable about the collaboration and that process of preparation. And so when the event eventually passed, I kind of realized that it would be a good idea to keep this going. And so I think we kept chats going after that. And I think that's at least how it started. I don't know, how did I do with that?
Pretty good. Yeah. Oh man, you definitely are one of the only friends that I can definitely say I met off of a spreadsheet. But I still remember when your submission came through and I was reviewing it. I was just like, I had no idea who this person is, but I really liked the idea of the zone of proximal development. I had not heard of that concept before. And so I thought it was really interesting. And yeah, the more time that we spent together, I think like at the beginning of 2023, we had like a half an hour a week or something like that. And then by like mid-year, we had 3 or 5 hours a week together. And that was, I thought that it was really a very natural way to kind of develop a course, because it's sort of strange to say that like, we've never been in the same room or even on the same continent as one another. But I definitely consider you a part of my central like world now. So yeah. Also looking back at that time, like both of us were in very different places in our lives and our careers. Like, do you even remember what was going on back at the beginning of 2023 for you?
It's crazy. It's crazy to even think like how much has happened since in such a short time. But I would say like the real central question that was sort of floating around my mind in all parts of my life at that time was like, am I going to stay at my job and kind of like keep working at this, climb up the career ladder as they say? Or was I kind of going to make the jump that I'd been talking so often about and kind of dreaming about at different stages? And like wrestling with that, it sort of forces you to ask some questions that you don't usually ask on the day-to-day basis. And so you might say when I was in that stage, it's very similar to the stage at which a lot of the participants in this first cohort were when they started with us. It's sort of like you're not necessarily sure where you're going. You're not sure how the next couple of months are even going to look, based on the decision that you want to make. And I think, we making that decision at the time was really difficult, because I think I didn't necessarily have a good sense of how somebody in the sort of design or tech space makes that shift from working a job to doing their own thing. And so you might say it was very timely that we started to engage at that point in time, so that I could actually see what that looks like in the real world. And it took time for me to actually see that through our engagement. But I think I got inklings of it from the very beginning. But it would be interesting to hear a little bit from your side, because, I've got a very one-dimensional perspective about, who you were at the time and where you were. This author who's written these books, achieved these things. And I think when people first see you, they might have that idea, like, where were you around that time when we first started engaging?
Yeah, I would definitely say that I was at a crossroads as well. I mean, I think that part of the peership that I developed with you made me face the fact that I didn't really know what I was anymore. Like I had just published my second book about 6 months earlier. I knew in my heart that I wanted to be a writer and a teacher full time, but I didn't have the courage to really say that just yet. But then through the exercise of us getting to know one another, it sort of felt like I was asked the right questions in the right momentum to not have to answer too fast. But in getting to know you, yeah, I kind of feel like I got to this place where I was starting to get to know the next version of myself. I turned 40. That was a big deal. That had happened right before we started spending a lot of time together. And yeah, I'm kind of moving into this next version of me in terms of having a elementary school aged kid and working for myself as the goal, as opposed to sort of how long will I get away with this for? Which is sort of how I had been thinking about it before. So I definitely feel like, at the beginning of 2023, I was definitely standing at that crossroads as well. Very similar to the students in this cohort, where I could have done all sorts of things. But I had to really face what I wanted to do. I remember the first time that you showed me the Ikigai stuff, and I was just like, oh God, does the world really need another version of Ikigai and finding yourself or whatever? But the more that we worked through it, the more I realized that those questions were impossible for me to answer when we started. And that was really kind of shocking. So I don't know. Could you actually give our listeners a quick overview of Ikigai and how you started thinking about it in early 23?
Yeah, definitely. Because, I always found those were the questions that I was always wrestling with as well. And so maybe I'll spend a little bit of time before giving the outline of what exactly it is, just describing why we were actually exploring it. And, it's a thing I think we'll maybe talk a little bit more about, the distinction between the peership and the self-reflection. But I think we came to the realization in our discussion, especially after considering the zone of proximal development, that to actually engage in that collaborative relationship, there's some kind of understanding of yourself that you need to have, so that you can communicate where you need help and where you're struggling. And so because of that, we started thinking a little bit about what might something might that look like? Is there a framework out there? Is there something that can guide that conversation? And so I first came across it in the form of this Venn diagram. If you do a Google search about meaning, the Ikigai typically comes up, both from the perspective of its historical relevance, but also I think it's used by a lot of coaches today. And I think that might be one of the reasons why there's always a little bit of an eyebrow raised when it's mentioned. And I definitely get that. But one of the things that I realized about it, from some of my own personal exploration trying to grapple with these difficult questions, was that it was one of the only approaches I found that was agnostic of your background. It didn't require you to believe a specific thing, be of a certain persuasion, or be in a certain camp to engage with it and inspect yourself in a thorough way. And so, we first we first looked at it from the diagram perspective. I think we were both sort of caught up in the diagram frenzy from the previous year,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to make that Venn diagram work. But I think it was only when you and I decided to put that to the side and
Mm-hmm.
engage with the questions that we really started to see what would be valuable for this cohort. And so if we just break it down, like the four key questions that we explored in this was first exploring a little bit about strengths, getting to understand how that actually comes forward, the strengths that you see within yourself, which others don't see, versus the ones which people maybe notice you a lot for. And then we kind of went into an exploration into, so it was strengths and then your passions, the things that you actually find a level of intrinsic enjoyment for. And I found this for me was one of the ones that was specifically interesting. And I'd actually like to get it hear from you as well, which of the four quadrants you found to be most engaging. But like exploring my passions, or specifically from the perspective of things that have intrinsic motivation, was always such a difficult question for me from when I was young, just because I always felt like I didn't know like how everyone else knew what they wanted to be or what they wanted to do. It felt like a question that I was always sort of grappling with. And this was one of the first times that I had like a series of questions that helped me think through them systematically. Maybe before we go on to the other four, did you have any of them that was specifically significant to you?
All of them were really hard, but I feel like one of the things I learned was that the first time I answered it, I kind of answered it to get it done. And you remember like the first time versus the second time.
Oh, yes, we definitely need to talk about that.
Yeah, like the first time I went through it, I was just like bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, and it was just it was definitely like, I don't know, a surface level version of it. And I feel like when I did it again with time and space in between and with the conversation, like I think that was the other thing that I realized is it wasn't just answering the question, it was having to voice your answer to somebody else. And one, make it make sense to the other person. And two, like feel okay about what you were saying. Because in a lot of cases, there were things I said that I was like, ooh, I don't know if I want that to be true. I mean, I remember specifically in the passions area, realizing that like, I don't have any non-work related hobbies anymore. It's like work hobbies. That's what I've got. And yeah, I'm really trying to improve on that. Like that's something that the last year I've put a lot of time and effort into because of those early conversations. As you know, I'm now building tiny furniture for my tiny garden house. So
exactly.
And my first non-work based hobby.
And I think you're totally right, because I think I like taking myself out of the perspective of the instructor for a second and as a student of these courses, because you and I did this together before, opening it up to students. I think one of the things I'm realizing now, especially looking back, is the value isn't even it's not in the framework, it's not in writing the questions. As you said, it's like needing to voice the things that usually only live in your head, because it's not often that somebody actually sits you down and asks you, tell me what you're passionate about, and like sits there and waits for you to answer.
Right.
And it's so good to have like, because I think the first time it's sort of like the question hits you and it kind of like leaves you breathless a little bit.
Yeah.
And you kind of need a bit of time to like really think through the question, because I had the exact same response, but I think it was maybe at the second stage, it was like I did my version of the reflection and shared it with you. But then in hearing how deep and like thorough you went, I sort of saw the falseness in the approach that I took, because like I answered the things that I would answer if somebody asked me that question in passing. Like, when somebody's like, hey, how are you? And they expect you to say, I'm good, thanks. It was like, I realized in hearing your approach that I was giving that answer and not actually really looking inside and listening for the answer that comes out when I ask myself the question. And I think it's that moment when you've had time to sit with the question, been supported / nudged into giving an answer, and then seeing how you feel about that answer, that you really get to understand the value of this like reflective approach.
Yeah. Yeah, that circle is so important because there was things that I wrote in my answers that I didn't know I was going to be uncomfortable about talking about until we were talking about it. And I was like, ooh, well, there's that sentence, and I've got to deal with that. There was also
Yeah.
another question that you asked. There was one, I think it was in the roles area, and it was about issues. And I remember that being like a really easy question for me to answer because I had like just this really tall list of like issues that I saw in the world. But then there was another question about like what you've done in the past to face those issues or to contribute towards those issues. And that I was like, I felt so defensive. I felt like so like, oh gosh, I've got to come up with things because I don't actually have a lot. And that's made me take a lot of, take like a second, third, fourth, and fifth look at some things since those conversations for sure.
Yeah, look, and I mean it's challenging because like as much as they're good questions to answer, they're also good questions to answer because they're so difficult.
Yeah.
And you know, I
Yeah.
mean, talking about issues that you believe need to be solved, and then immediately in the back of that needed like being asked about like what you specifically
Yeah.
did.
So what are you doing about it?
It's
Yeah.
like it's confronting.
Yeah.
But I think the reason that it's valuable is it's you confronting yourself. It's not like you're not being forced to do it in public, or a situation
Right.
happens and now you need an answer, or you know you need to hold a specific ground because of an incident that happened. It's like you've got the space to be confronted, but at the same time like no real pressure to kind of like deal with it immediately. And so maybe before we we go too far off the tangents, the last two aspects, the one that you mentioned was about the different ways that you serve. And I think on that one, it may just be good to identify the fact that that's one of the ones which you and I maybe tailored a little bit to our own purposes. Because I think in its original form, or at least in the original form that's often used in coaching, the concept is how you make money or how you get paid. And I think one of the like the concepts we came to, actually, I think maybe it might be better hearing it a little bit from you, because I think it was really you that pointed out the fact that there's a different and better way to think about it.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much limiting factor in terms of what you can get paid for, especially when it comes to like what you can currently get paid for. Like I feel like if you're looking for growth, that focusing on passions and what you're good at, regardless of whether or not they can be an immediate income source, can just be like a really good reframe for folks. And so I was really, I think you and I were both very concerned about this not being a like career development course. We really wanted it to be about people's lives and about their whole self. And so it felt very against those values for us to include like some expectation that you would be having to think about that. And we've definitely seen some folks in the program that like have good steady jobs that are, you know, not a part of the crossroads that they're currently at. The crossroads that they're currently at is totally different. And they're good where they're at in terms of their making money. So finding, like for me specifically, like I actually feel like one of those people. Like I'm not trying to find myself professionally right now. But there's a lot about like what I'm passionate about and the ways that I can serve that don't have anything to do with my like income or like the way that I make money. But I think that they're some of the more valuable things that I could be thinking about in this particular season of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I think at the same time, like, you know, it wasn't at all that we were averse to you, like an individual exploring that, because we had people in this cohort some who were really exploring things from the professional perspective, and others who were really like, you know, exploring their network and creative drives. And so I think our aim was to expand the scope rather than necessarily, you know, remove something. And I think, you know, we're better off for it. Hopefully, as time goes on, we'll get to hear some stories firsthand from some of the students.
I'm glad that you brought that up. Honestly, I had completely forgotten that we made that edit. Like honestly, like I completely that part of the history had escaped me. So yeah, thank you for reminding me of that, because that is an important thing for us to
Yeah,
acknowledge that is different about this version.
and I mean, if you think about where this, like some of our students have landed up, it's like they could have landed up in a very different place if that question had been different.
Oh yeah, this course would be
Like,
very different if that question
mm,
was different. Yeah.
yeah, so
Words
definitely
matter.
glad that we picked it. Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so and that really was like the first at least milestone I think that our students kind of engaged with together. You know, there was a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
preparation before, but I think the second aspect for me that's really
Oh,
interesting.
wait, the fourth one though. We don't want to miss the fourth one because we haven't talked
Oh,
about
that's right.
community.
Yes.
And
You
I
are
think
right.
that if we were gonna pinpoint one that was maybe the most difficult for our cohort, it would
Yes.
be that one.
Hmm.
Yeah. So.
No, 100%. Yeah. So we just talked about the different ways that you serve or the roles that you play, but it's like you're playing those roles in a specific group. You know, there are people who you're connected to, and so the final aspect of exploration or of the self reflection was focused around, you know, in some ways it's the language was seemed somewhat indirect, but it was the problems that you see in the world, right? And the reason for that is because you have to be able to answer that question, to be able to answer about problems that you see, you have to be able to have a good understanding of how you define your world. Like, does
Mhm.
that mean your family and your friends? Does that mean your colleagues? Does that mean, like, the people that you live with in your city, in your complex, whatever it might be? There's this dual problem of, like, on the one hand, who are the people that you're connected to? Like, where do your networks go? Where do you get your support from? And where do you put your resources and energy into providing support? And then what are the challenges that surround those communities? And I think, this final part, and I'm glad that you brought it up, is so important because it gives you a clear space to explore how you're connected to other people and if
Mhm.
you're connected to other people. And I think this was
Ooh,
one of the
that
challenging
was tough.
questions that a lot of people had to grapple with. Um,
Yeah.
and I think when we get to connection bingo, we can dive a little bit more into that. But
Yeah,
before we
for
do,
sure.
there's one thing I'm super keen to talk about because I've been reading about it lately, and it's this question about continuums and values.
Mm. Mm.
I'd really love for you to share a little bit about that framework and some of the thoughts that kind of brought it to being.
Yeah. So if you had told me that we would be using balancing continuums to help people make sense of themselves, I don't know that I would have believed you. But there was a certain point where when we were working on kind of helping people to understand like how to make decisions about what they were going to do next with their life, where I was thinking about my consulting time and how of all the tools that I've ever used in workshops and stakeholder interviews and those kinds of interactions where you're deep in the heart of an organization, continuums are one of the most effective. It's a simple line with two ends. You label the ends and then you talk about where on the line you are. But for whatever reason, it like solves real problems. And so we started
Mm,
to look at that from a standpoint of like making decisions for themselves. And honestly, when I look back on it, I started finding continuums in my journals for years. I've been using continuums to make sense of myself. And like they're one of the
mm,
prime objects coming out of therapy that I tend to like visualize things as. And yeah, I ended up like really digging deep into this idea of like we can have values. We can say we have these values, but how are we actually living towards those values? And if you think about it, it's very similar to a company having a strategy and then them tactically moving towards that strategy or away from that strategy.
mm,
So initially, I had thought, okay, I'm going to bring in those kinds of continuums, and that'll be great. Like that'll be super useful. And I remember we had this meeting where I was showing you sort of like the first version of what I was thinking, and you brought up the idea that maybe the value needed to be at the center instead of on one of the extremes. And we started to think about this like, what would it look like to undervalue a value and what would it look like to overvalue value. And that is when both of us started to really like get shamed by our values on the regular. Like we started making decisions that oh no, this does not line up on the value continuum at all. Like one of the most useful ones for me for the last couple of months has been I value authenticity, but when I undervalue authenticity, it can feel crafted. It can feel like doing it for the plot or skipping the messy parts. And when I overvalue authenticity, it can feel like trauma dumping, oversharing, you know, just like too much. And I feel like thinking about all of my values from that perspective of like the extremes on each end, and also like admitting that at any given moment, I could be anywhere on that spectrum, and that it's not like, oh, my goal is to always be on that end and to never wander over. And that it really is like momentary life decisions that make it whether or not you are living in your values. So yeah, that was like a mind-blowing tool for me, for sure.
I think I have to say, even, you know, and maybe I'm speaking on behalf of others, but from the students as well, it's definitely the part that got the most, you know, shocked eyes and hand over mouth moments.
I mean, you and I have had this conversation already, but like when the diagrams come out, people tend to be unstuck.
And I think there's something significant about that, because one of the things for me, especially looking back, that I only realized, and it was like a couple of weeks ago. So, I mean, quite a bit after we actually did it ourselves and then ran it with the students, is that the thing that I consistently got out of that is it's a good way to show me what I'm scared of. It's like knowing what you overvalue and knowing what you undervalue is basically the two directions in which fear comes from.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's like, you know, if I think about one of the ones that I chose, like in my center, I have this idea about collaboration and being with people and being connected. And on the one hand, you know, I often think about, on the one hand, that it can make me kind of like dependent on other people and a little bit flim-flammy because I'm always taking advice from other perspectives. But I hadn't fully come to the realization that on the other side, this thing that I was actually scared about is being alone and loneliness. It's like I had thought about it as a fear, and I had thought about it I had thought about it as a thing that, you know, that I think about, but I never put the two together. That like my draw to social engagement and collaboration is not only about the fact that I enjoy it. It's also, it's like, here's an aspect that, you know, you're always on the lookout for. And kind of having it out on paper or outside of yourself is so good, because when you're in the thrall of emotion and a lot of things are happening at you, it's like just a centering force.
Yes.
And like, yeah, definitely keeps you in check.
Oh my gosh. I remember there was a part of that assignment for students where we were like, a good way to look at these continuums is to, you know, gut check them on your last decision that you made and see how you did. And I remember that week that we were writing that lesson, I happened to have a big decision to make, and I brought the continuums exercise to a meeting that you and I had, and I was like shamed to filth over that thing. Like I could not. I was like, I could see it so clearly that like my brain, from fear, like really wanted to undervalue certain parts, overvalue others, and come up with this like Frankenstein of an answer, as opposed to like when I thought about the actual answer, like that I came up at the end, it was the one that struck on the center of every single one. It was like I wasn't compromising on any of them. And it's almost like how could that be? Like they're a random set of words, like how? But yeah, I think that's really, it's one of those like information architecture truths. It's like, it's always less scary when it's out of your head, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of things that people are scared of, do you want to talk about interviews? Because I think like if I had to pick the single thing that our students were like, I'll get to it. Yeah, no, I'll get to it. I'm going to do it. No bigs. It would be the interviews. So why don't you tell our listeners about what we assigned them to do and how we went about it?
100%. So I think this one was broken up into two bits, but really I think what you and I realized is, you know, the Ikigai as a reflective process gives you a good framework to kind of like ask yourself a broad range of questions that kind of get you in the right mindset to be having these kinds of conversations, to be talking about growth, to be talking about, where you want to see yourself. But it's like looking at your life from your own perspective leaves you with blind spots. And so you kind of need a different way you need like a different source of information. And so, at least in the beginnings, what we were thinking about is this is a great way to do that. Ask a little bit about some of the questions which you've been reflecting on and see if you can get an alternate perspective. Little did we know when we actually put together this activity that it would be like, it wouldn't be the talking about a mission that would get in your way. It wouldn't be like these deep, intense, reflective questions that you have to ask yourself. It's like, go and ask another person about yourself. Is literally, I think, where most people really got tripped up. Mm-hmm. And I think it really does say something about this, like, or you could say that it's in some ways a sign of the times. Like, it is difficult to go and it's easy to ask somebody about, what you should do about your job, or like, where you should go and work, where you should go and interview. It's like when you're just going to ask somebody about yourself and who you are as a person, it's like the stakes suddenly seem to just, yeah. And so I think it's been an interesting ride. I don't know whether you had any experiences or perspectives specifically about these interviews that kind of like stuck out to you, or the students' experience.
Yeah, I definitely think that like there was one student who I remember when we were first giving the assignment was like, oh, I do this for a living. Like interviews, like stakeholder interviews, user interviews, like this is my jam. This is going to be the easy part. And I remember like a couple weeks later when she still hadn't done an interview, we were sort of like, that's interesting. And I think it was probably around week 6 where that person acknowledged that it was really hard for them to have that conversation with somebody else because they're used to doing that when there's a different product to be talked about. But when they're the product, all of a sudden it's a much different feeling. And so, yeah, I think like every one of the students definitely experienced that level. And I still remember like writing the list of people to interview for myself. And I was just like, oh God, like some of them I was like, I really want to know what the answers are, but I don't want to have this conversation. So I think that's one of the harder parts of this course, honestly.
Exactly. But I do think, and this was the thing, there were like 2 layers of value to extract from this process, and it would be great if you could share a little bit about how we actually came to selecting these names for the people that the student actually interviewed.
Oh yeah. So unsurprisingly, I made a bingo card. I love a bingo card. Like I don't know. It's just such a succinct, like 25 prompts is just such a nice way to organize things. So yeah, we came up with 5 qualities of what we would be looking for in terms of who we would encourage our students to ask to be interviewed. And then for each of those qualities, we came up with 5 prompts. And so the prompts were things like, someone that you admire for the way that they balance their work and their life, or someone that you wish that you had stayed in better touch with, or somebody that who currently has the job that you wish that you had. And so they were all just kind of like little thought starters. And our kind of advice to the team was that if somebody came up more than once on that list, that they would be a really prime candidate for the interviewing process. And I think it was just filling out the card, I think, was its own value. And then using it to decide who to interview, I think, was of additional value.
Exactly. Because I think the thing that's as you mentioned, is like using it as a tool to figure out who you want to interview is useful. But just doing the accounting of your network is like, who are the people that you rely on for support? It's like, you rarely ever ask yourself that question, except when you're in the middle of a crisis. Yeah. And so it's like, this is often it can be the first time you've asked yourself that question when you're not in a crisis. And you actually have the time to think about it and see like, is there somebody who is like just a stone's throw away that you've in some sense been neglecting that's available? Or is there somebody in your past that you can like go back and kind of like reach out to again? So I think that one was definitely one of the hidden gems.
Absolutely. And like one of the keys of the program is this idea of peership, but then we kind of backed it into this introspection work. But I feel like by the time we got to week 8, there was this really interesting moment where we introduced our students to who they were going to be working with for the rest of the time together. And it was awesome because honestly, it felt like it could have been any of them pairing with any of them at that point. And I really chalk that up mostly to the way that we gave them instruction for how to run those conversations with each other through the first 8 weeks. It was sort of like playing with the idea of being a peer and holding space and sharing space and sharing time. But I think it'd be really interesting to go through, like, can you walk us through the 3 conversations that we assigned to those peer groups at the end?
Yeah, definitely. It was quite an interesting process because I think you and I had been somewhat figuring it out organically in our ongoing, 12-month conversation.
Yeah.
But it's essentially breaking down a peership into 3 types of conversations. The first is about exploring what your own personal incentives are in some sense, but through the perspective of the values that you've been exploring. So, we had that continuum activity and you got to get a sense of, what is the ideal middle you're looking for and when are you sort of stepping away from that. And so the first part of this process is learning how to communicate that to another person. Because in a sense, that list of values is your manual for how you make decisions. And so a person who is collaborating with you, if you are able to communicate your values to them and you actually believe those values, they can even get an understanding of what your intentions are before you share them. That level of collaboration can reach a stage of intention rather than just verbatim words. And so that's kind of like the first aspect of the conversation. And I think it's a great place to start to get to know one another. But it obviously requires, the previous couple of weeks of reflection to do before you're prepared to have that conversation.
Yeah.
And then the second one is focused around, like, you've talked about your value. Oh, and then you've set a milestone. Sorry, that was the part of it that I forgot to mention. So there's this thing that you value and you set for yourself an achievable goal that's, a couple of meters out within your zone of proximal development. And that's the full circle from my initial talk from Sensemakers, the Sensemakers Club. But sort of like looking for that milestone which you can attempt, and you can attempt reasonably, while at the same time having a measure of achievement in your values. And then your second conversation was focused around getting obstacles out of the way. And, it was so crazy, like, as the students were going through this part of the process, you and I were actually using this tool with real problems in our lives. And it's like,
yeah,
it's such a funny experience because on the one hand, you're trying to be an instructor, but on the other hand, it's like, you're also living your real life. And these tools are being used in your real life. And then the last conversation is sort of closing the loop on the cycle. You've set your goal. You've kind of had this conversation where you talk about a problem and how to solve and approach it. The third one is sort of where you reflect back and kind of address this question of, are you moving in the right direction? Is your milestone helping you achieve the values that you hold? And if it is, you kind of keep along on that direction. And if it isn't, you kind of go through this whole pivot or persevere question. And that, very briefly, is sort of like the idea of this iterative cycle. And I think it's something I say we've hit like the surface of it. We've kind of like gotten to the stage where we've got a working model, but I think it can definitely like grow and expand in its forms. But it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from your perspective, like how have you found kind of going through these kinds of conversations, and like how are you finding trying them out?
I feel like the focus on short-term milestones has been really interesting for me, just because I feel like I am a long-term planner type of person, where I'll have kind of like that far out vision of a thing, and I can like make the project plan to kind of get there and go step by step. But the idea of like experimenting with a milestone or doing something that is different than what you know how to do with a milestone, I think is a really impactful thing. Like I'm playing with a big business idea right now, and sort of like the idea of like coming up with something that's small enough that I can kind of give myself a little bit of energy towards it and test out the idea in like lower risk ways. I think that's been really important for me. Also, just like the slowing down of the conversation. Like, I really like that we're not trying to get the students or ourselves like through that entire thing in one conversation. Like, we're breaking it up and we're saying like there should be space and time and you living life and trying stuff in between these milestone meetings. And I think that that's been really valuable to them and to me. Yeah.
I think you're definitely right, and I experienced that to myself. It's sort of like in the time in between. And I think we talked a little bit about it before, but it's the time in between when you've answered the question or talked about the thing, and then you get to think about it. That you actually really get the value of going through the process. And so I guess in some ways this is where the current cohort is sort of like closing this circle right now. You know, they've gone through their 3 conversations, and today we get to walk with them through some of that. But I think one of the things that you and I have found going through this process, you know, communicating our values, talking about the things that we want to do in the world, some of the challenges we face, and the things like the fears that we face along that journey, we've kind of come to see that we're very, very different in some very strange ways, and very similar in some other ways. And you know, so much so that I guess, you know, we started putting together a bit of a list. I don't know if you want to share some of that story.
I do have a list on my desk. This list has been on my desk for almost a year at this point. I'm just gonna focus on the top 3 because there's a lot of them. But I think top ones are the amount of analysis that you and I do into other people, context, circumstances, like reading between the lines. Like, I'm an over-analyzer, and you are definitely an under-analyzer. Self-described.
That's putting it lightly, so thank you.
Yeah. Like, I remember there was one day where Alfie told me that he sends text messages without reading them. Like, he just types the message and then hits send, and I like almost went into shock. That's like, what? I would never thought that was an option. 2, I am incredibly introverted, and like one-on-one interaction is like the best way for me to interact with people. But Alfie is like extrovert to the max, like needs people, needs collaboration, needs the group.
100%.
Yeah. And then I would say the third one, top 3, would be the planner. Like, I am such a planner. Like, I want to know what we're doing in June already. And Alfie is like, what about February? Let's finish February first before we talk about June.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's been a fun list to like add to over time. There was also a few weeks back though when we came up with a list on your encouragement, actually, about the ways that we're similar. So maybe, do you want to share that part of the list?
Yeah, definitely, because this is also just like, and I think maybe it's why we get along so well, is like the parts that we're the same, we're like super keen on. And the first is like our deep passion for deep chats. I think
deep chat.
that one has shown itself from the very beginning. And I'm glad that it's one of the ones, because people very often get tired of my talking. And I think the second... Would you look at that? The second, we aim to help people. And maybe I'd like to hear a little bit from your perspective on this one, only because I think there's a way to look at that and see like a very sort of like a cliche sort of perspective. I like to help people. But at least from my perspective, I think there is more to it than that.
Yeah. No, I think it's, for me, it's about like, I want to make helpful things. I don't want to put things into the world that are not helpful. And I sometimes believe that the thing that's the most like traditional or the way things always are is sometimes the least helpful. So I feel like that's another way that you and I are really similar, is just in like, we're both very open to like divergence in terms of thought. Like, we're okay with breaking the model, or like, you know, like,
coloring
is there like, there like a model that's central to Japanese culture and we just like want to break it and do something different, we will. And I think that that's like, yeah, I only have so many friends that are like that. But in like it's not to entertain me. It's not to like, it's not for art. It really is like to help people. Like I think we both share a genuine interest in like our students, for example. Like we really do want them to make sense of themselves, at least a little during this course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. And also with each other. Like I feel like we've been incredibly supportive and helpful to each other over this.
And I think like, I mean, not to get into any details, but like I think each of us have brought some pretty hefty conversations to the table.
Yes.
And I don't think either of us has backed down from the challenge or the difficulty of it, which is rare.
Yeah, no, I mean, you definitely, our friendship was formed during one of the roughest years of my life. So you definitely saw a lot of that stuff. And I feel like the underpinnings of what we developed together was the reason that we could do that and still like maintain professional like progress while still making time and space for us each to be people and be going through some stuff. We didn't try to compartmentalize that or like ignore it at all, which I really think was to our success for sure.
And just hearing you say that made me realize like that to me is a significant feather in the cap, because it's something I've always found unsatisfactory about the professional environment, is just needing to compartmentalize yourself.
Yeah.
And maybe there are some people who
like,
need that.
How are you? I'm fine. It's like
exactly.
Are you fine? I'm not fine.
Yeah.
I've been fine for a really long time. But I keep saying it to people that I am not safe to say the real thing to. So yeah.
Exactly. And so the third one on our list, and to tie it all off, is we are both neurodivergent in different ways, but similarly in other ways. And we're also both super unacademic, as some might put it. But I think it's again that sort of coloring outside the lines researching. And so it's been cool to kind of find a kindred spirit very many kilometers or miles across the seas.
We could also talk about how I've learned how absolutely how North American I am. Like I'm just so absolutely unaware of the fact that it's different seasons in different parts of the world and that there's different measurements for literally everything. And
but I have to say, on that note, it's actually been really cool for me, because a lot of those could be social faux pas in the wrong audience. And like I feel like I can ask questions that might be otherwise touchy. And like, with an understanding that I'm going to get an honest response, because, it's coming from a place of not knowing and wanting to understand. And so I think that has also been quite cool for me, because I think I'm always a little bit more guarded speaking to somebody from, a different culture. So it's been good to kind of see that, that common ground can be built.
Plus I can be your cultural guide to this season on America.
And that is one entertaining show.
Yeah. So entertaining.
Okay, so we've explored a little bit of how we're different and a little bit of how about how we're the same. I guess the question is like, where are we in those, like between those right now? It's like, where are you in life right now? We've kind of gone through this process of making sense with our students, but it leaves us with the question of, where are we with making sense of ourselves? And so I don't know if you want to give a little bit of an update about where you are and how you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most recent update for me might be best encapsulated by talking about a conversation you and I had last week about fear. There's been this ongoing conversation between you and I about like the Sensemakers Club business and, my personal brand and books and all that. And like, what am I and what am I not? And there was this meeting maybe like a month ago, where I just was like, I'm not this and I'm not this and I'm not this and no this and no, 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 no. And you very gently were like, hey, what would happen if you like looked at that list and asked, hey, are there any things on that list there because of fear? And so I went back through and I labeled 2 of a list of like 10 as fear. And I sent it to you and I was like so proud of myself. Like, you're right. 2 of these were fear. Look at me. And then I think it was like less than 24 hours later. And then I wrote you back and I was like, actually, they're all based on fear. And here's the actual answers to the questions. So yeah, I think that that's basically like, I think that's probably like the how made sense of am I at this point? Like, I'm at that point. I'm at the like, I have a lot of decisions to make about how I want to live in my values and what I want to do next with my time. My kid's going to start kindergarten, which is like a gigantic change of pace for our family coming up. And so, yeah, I think I'm not very made sense of, but I feel really comfortable in my skin currently, which is nice.
This is good. Yeah.
How about you, Alfie? How made sense of are you at the moment?
How made sense of? I would say I am, if I were to put a percentage on it, I would say I'm at about maybe 35 or 40% made sense of, which is a huge improvement.
Alfie, loading.
Exactly. Installing update. That's somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I think like where I think I really am right now, somewhat is also realizations about fear. I think it was maybe a week later after you had come to this kind of like facing this aspect. Maybe the thing that was a little bit different on my side is I realized the fear first, but didn't understand how it was affecting my decisions. Because I think I had this kind of like big opportunity kind of like roll by, and I was like, why am I not doing the obvious thing here? There's something that's like holding back, and when I asked myself that, I was like, okay, this is as a result of fear, but it's like, what exactly? Because I'm like, who is afraid of good opportunities? How does that make sense?
Spoil of riches.
And so, like, coming to this question about like the things I want to do because of obligation and the things I want to do because of my own interests is a question that I'm grappling with at the moment. So at least from a headspace perspective, that's where I am. But generally in life, I think I am in quite a good space, considering how much change has happened over the past couple of months. Yeah, I think I've been on quite a little bit of a roller coaster, and I'd say I'm around neutral, maybe a little bit above, but contrasting that from where I've been at a few moments over the past, it's like it's a good place to be. Yeah. Good. And I think that's how it made sense.
We did. We recorded a podcast. Now, we wanted to close our podcast by each giving some parting advice for seekers out there making sense of themselves. Do you want to start? Do you have something?
Yeah. It may take time, but find somebody that you're willing to face hard questions with. Everything else can be dealt with. Like, no matter how scary it is. And maybe, this is projecting my own interests / fears onto things, but like facing things alone is not worthwhile.
Yeah. Find yourself as an introvert, I can say that's not an extroverted thing to say. I agree with that advice entirely. I would say mine would be look again. Like, there's been a lot of points in this process specifically where I felt like I knew the answer really quickly, and then when I looked again, there was more. And that more was usually more true and more me. So yeah, I would say look again. Yeah. Whew. We did it, man. We've been wanting to do a podcast for like at least 6 months of this whole thing. We've been like, we should really start a podcast. So I'm going to sign us off, our first podcast. Until next time, Sensemakers, be clear.